Hello and welcome to the 30th episode of Naturally Scott. I'm your host, Scott Harris, and man, we've hit 30 episodes, which I think is pretty cool. Today's episode is with a gentleman named Jerry Lorenz. Jerry recently retired from Florida Audubon, and he is still an estuarine ecologist at Florida International University, and he studies estuaries, predominantly in southern Florida, the Biscayne Bay and the Florida Bay, and working with the Everglades, and has been doing that for decades. And one of his areas of focus is what are known as the pink birds, the flamingos and the roseate spoonbills, but all wading birds, the ibises and the herons and whatnot. And he studies those in relationship to the salt and fresh water and the filling in of canals and all the things that are going on in southern Florida as we attempt to reverse the damage we had done when we spent decades draining the Everglades. Now, we're going to talk about Hurricane Idalia, which hit in 2023, which brought flamingos. We're going to talk a lot about flamingos, man, so that's going to be pretty cool, and how they might be making a comeback in Florida, and if so, where, and if so, how long do we think it'll take before they settle in? We're going to go back 100 years to women's fashion when nearly all of the great wading birds were slaughtered and extirpated in Florida, the herons and the flamingos and the roseate spoonbills and the ibises, all in the name of women's fashion. Women wanted to wear those on their hats, so people were willing to go into the swamps and slaughter those birds and bring them the feathers. We're going to talk about the murder of two game wardens in Florida who were trying to stop that from happening. And we're going to talk about the future of southern Florida. It is a great conversation with Jerry. He is tremendously experienced and knowledgeable about what's going on in southern Florida with the Everglades and the bays and the Everglades restoration and all of those things. So it is a fascinating, important conversation. I hope you enjoy it. And when we're done, stay tuned for the field notes. And have a great day. And as always, stay curious. Welcome to this edition of Naturally Scott. I'm your host, Scott Harris. Excited to have you here today. I think it's another fascinating topic, although I feel like I'm repeating myself at the beginning of every one of these podcasts because they all seem fascinating to me. My guest today is Jerry Lorenz. We had not met previously, and I had read an article that Jerry authored about flamingos. We're going to talk a lot about flamingos today, and we'll touch on some other things, but I find it a fascinating subject. I love the article, and I'm very appreciative that Jerry was kind enough to accept the invitation and join us. So, Jerry, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you, Scott. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You bet. Now, before we fire it up, a couple of things. We're going to talk a little bit about your background so that we have an understanding of that. But maybe before that, you can swing around and share with the audience the view as to where you're seated, because it's kind of pretty.
Yeah, this is just my yard, and I'm sitting outside because I had internet problems, and I was saying I got this water feature here. And
That's beautiful.
Yeah, in the Keys, we get migrants this time of year, a lot of raptors and a lot of warblers, and I just sit here and watch birds. It's a nice place to sit.
And you've got a screech owl over your right, a screech owl box over your right shoulder.
Yeah, we it's a bit of a sad story. Is for years and years and years we had screech owls nesting in our yard. We have like 3 boxes, and about 6 years ago they seem to have abandoned the area, and it's just because the Keys are getting so developed that there just isn't a habitat. You can see I've tried to keep the habitat, but that doesn't mean my neighbors have. So, it's one of those things, and we just hope they keep hoping that they'll come back, because it's a lot of fun and very rewarding to watch young screech owls fledge.
Well, first of all, fingers crossed that they do come back. And we were talking before the recording, you and I share that. I've got that exact same box out at our bird sanctuary, which is in the front yard between the main house and the guest house. And we had the eastern screech owls that fledged 3 last year in 2024. And as I mentioned to you earlier, we got the male back in 25, but then we heard a barred owl calling and he took off. We never saw him again. Yeah. So I'm not certain, but I'm praying we get him back. We can hear eastern screeches, so we know they're nesting in the area, but not in the front yard.
I haven't heard a screech owl in this neighborhood in probably 4 or 5 years, which is really sad because it's such a delightful sound.
Have you read Carl Safina's book, Alfie and Me?
No, but I know Carl, and okay. I know Alfie, actually.
Oh, okay.
So many years ago, I spent a week with Carl out on Long Island when I was I had been at Audubon for probably 5 years, and Carl had just begun writing his first book, and I asked him if I could come up and kind of shadow him for a week. And no, I did not know he had a book out about that situation. But yeah, it's one of the most memorable things I've done is spending a week with Carl. We went fishing off of Long Island, and at that
That's
time he
fantastic.
was he was writing. I don't know if I don't think he had written Song for the Blue Ocean yet, but he was working on it.
Okay.
And we came in after striper fishing for the day, and there were a bunch of tuna fishermen. Of course, they all knew Carl, and I was expecting a confrontation, and instead he walked over and sat down at their picnic table, and they were carving up a tuna, and we just sat with them and had sushi. So
That
it was pretty amazing.
that's about as good as sushi gets, by the way.
Yes, it is.
This is the book, Alfie and Me by Carl. It's a great book. He's got an eastern screech owl named Alfie who's lived in right under his office window. The owl lives under the office window and has successfully nested for a number of years. Carl is a guest in my book, Why We Love Birds, and is an upcoming guest on the podcast. But it's a terrific book. Of course, I haven't spent a week with him in Long Island, so you might not need to read the book. On
No,
the
I
other hand,
do. I do. That's a new thing if he's talking about because he had just it's so long ago, Scott. I don't quite remember the details, but he had a relationship with a screech owl then, and this cannot I wouldn't think this can possibly be the same owl.
I wouldn't think so either. But there is nest fidelity, and so if you lose the female, the male keeps coming back, and hopefully vice versa. But nonetheless, when you get a chance, read it. It's a terrific book. It's a great
I
story. It's
will
half
pick that up.
philosophy,
I will
half
absolutely.
owl. I think Carl's a great philosopher as much as an ornithologist or scientist. But so now let's focus on you, Jerry. You recently retired after 35 years with Florida Audubon. And the Florida Audubon website describes you as an estuarine scientist, but you are also a professor at Florida International University, and they describe you as an estuarine ecologist. So is there a difference between the two? And what exactly is that?
Well, an estuarine ecologist is I have studied, well, mostly the place where I work are Florida Bay in South Florida, which is bordered on the south by the Florida Keys and on the north by the Everglades. And of course, the Everglades sheet flow is what provides Florida Bay its fresh water source. And I also work in Biscayne Bay, which is better known for Miami, right? But I work in the southern part of Biscayne Bay, which is pretty wild unto itself and used to be connected to the Everglades, but no longer really is. And so those two, the dichotomy between those two bays is what I work on. Of course, the estuaries, the reason, I have been to other estuaries, studied in other estuaries, but that is where freshwater meets, it's basically generally where rivers flow into the ocean. They tend to be areas that have created a bay. For example, the Bay of Pigs in Cuba is an estuary. And so what happens when you mix freshwater flowing into saltwater is you get a very, very productive environment because the runoff from the land brings in nutrients that are not that are depleted in oceans by the organisms that live there. And so you have that mix and vice versa. The ocean provides the freshwater nutrients that freshwater environments deplete. And so you have these really highly productive environments. And in particular, Florida Bay and Biscayne Bay are the tail end of the Everglades. And of course, the federal and state governments have spent, already tens of billions of dollars in restoring the Everglades. And so that is where my expertise is how does the Everglades restoration impact these environments? And by the way, Florida Bay is 90% of it is in Everglades National Park, and Biscayne Bay is where Biscayne National Park is. So I also have a very direct link with the National Park Service.
Okay. And let's talk about that investment and how that's translated into practical stuff. But let's back up. So when the freshwater meets the saltwater and the nutrients are mixing and replenishing each other is what it sounds like. How does that translate into fish and birds and wildlife? What is the impact of of nutrient transfer?
Well, it stimulates productivity, and obviously the plants are the primary producers, and so you get these like in Florida Bay. Florida Bay is known, and it goes back and forth between the Australian coast as to which has the larger seagrass, continuous seagrass bed, the Florida Keys, or I forget, Shark Bay in Australia. And it depends on who does the measurement, but there seems to be this competition between the two. Regardless, this is one of the most extensive seagrass beds in the world. And of course, I go out into Florida Bay, and there are problems with that seagrass bed. That is what started Everglades restoration, is when the seagrasses started to die in mass.
When was that?
That was in between 1987 and 1992. There's a 5-year drought, and the bay got extraordinarily salty. There's a lot of things going on at the same time. Obviously, the Everglades was not delivering fresh water. It had been rerouted, and even the water that was arriving at the wrong place and the wrong time. Bottom line is we had massive seagrass die-off. And that being the base of the food web, we also saw declines in the game fish. Florida Bay is the Isla Mirada, where I'm sitting, claims to be the fishing capital of the world. And our economy is based on fishing and diving. And so all of these things came together, and really, because it was so highly visible at the time, that's what jump-started Everglades restoration. Let's fix Florida Bay.
I've got to stop for just 1 second, only because my wife and I have vacationed probably 4 or 5 times in Isla Mirada. I absolutely love it. It is so beautiful down there.
And I'm sorry about the traffic. Like I said, my internet's down. So no,
No,
it
I
is.
get
It is you can see the land is beautiful. I enjoy being on the water much more. And since I've retired, I don't get out as much on the water as I would like, but still trying to be active, and let's let that go by. It's garbage day in my neighborhood. What can you do?
We live out so remotely, we don't have garbage service out here.
So,
We've gotta pack our stuff up and bring it to the dump every time.
I do remember the days when I had to pack up any recycling that I had, and the Keys have really the population has exploded since I moved here. So I've seen a lot of changes here in the Keys.
Okay. And you've also obviously seen a lot of changes with the estuaries and the Everglades and the bays and whatnot. So is the arrow pointing in the right direction? Are we making progress in restoring and saving?
Yeah, we're making progress. We're a long way from for me anyway, for declaring success. I still don't see the things that were really plentiful when I first arrived in the Keys many years ago, but certainly it is not the devastation that got me this job when I started in 1989. And that's, I guess, where we end up with the birds is the number of birds nesting in the Everglades in the 80s and early 90s. They were estimated at less than 10,000 nesting pairs throughout the entire Everglades ecosystem, which extends from Orlando to Florida Bay. And in 2018 and again in 2021, we had over 100,000 nesting pairs of wading birds in that same area. So that tells you that things are really improving. The birds that I study wading birds. I'm mostly known for looking at the interaction between roseate spoonbills, the other pink wading bird here in the Keys, and the productivity of the estuary, the fish that the spoonbill eats. And unfortunately, the numbers of spoonbills in Florida Bay have dramatically gone down. And initially that was because the Everglades were not healthy. And now that the Everglades are healthy, we have an added bonus of sea level rise makes the water too deep for those birds to forage. And so now they are abandoning Florida Bay, which sounds like a bad thing, but they're moving upland. So they're moving deeper into the Everglades, and their numbers are exploding. So that is another good sign. The indicator species that I study, roseate spoonbills, there's probably more spoonbills in the state of Florida today than there have been since they were hunted to extirpation in the early 1900s.
And we're going to talk about that, women's fashion and all those things. But backing up for just a moment, the wading birds, you've got the white ibis, the wood storks, and then what you call the pink birds, the roseate spoonbills, and the flamingos, right?
That's correct.
Are those the predominant wading birds? And that has been
Yep.
a focus of your career, is is tracking those birds and doing what you can to restore the health.
That is correct. Yes. And
Okay.
again, mostly focused on spoonbills until about 12 years ago when I started working on flamingos.
Okay. And while we're not done, and if we stop making an effort, we'll backtrack quickly, you do believe that we've progressed, that we're making progress in saving these birds and their habitat?
Absolutely. And it's the spoonbills are not the only thing we look at. We look at the other wading birds and they seem to be doing fine. The other wading birds that we look at are things like reddish egrets, tricolored herons, snowy egrets, little blue herons. So there's a good number of wading birds that are around here that are doing very well. But it's not just them, right? I like most of my publications, my scientific publications, and I think I have, I don't know, 60 or 70. Most of them are about fish, the things that these birds eat. And the way that we study fish really shows that again, their productivity has gone up, but we also have conflicting factors. Just like sea level rise with the spoonbills, we now have these introduced species that are wiping out the native species. And so, even though the Everglades unto themselves, we've made great strides in restoring natural flows, we still have a long way to go to complete that effort, but there are other conflicting factors that have come along as well. And
So,
it's really become difficult to tease those apart. And that's kind of been my job for the last decade, is to look at separate what's good from Everglades restoration and what's bad from other sources like sea level rise, climate change, and introduced species.
okay. So, for example, what are the fish in an ideal world? What would the spoonbills be eating?
Sheep's head, things that your listeners probably have never heard of. Sheep's head minnows, sailfin mollies, rainwater killifish, mosquito fish. So these are just, most people just call them top minnows or minnows. They're just little.
Okay.
Spoonbill can't eat anything. Well, I shouldn't say that. I would guess that 99.9% of a spoonbill's diet are fish that are less than 3 inches long.
Okay.
So their bill is designed to catch fish. They will eat other things. They eat mollusks. They eat shrimp. Everybody says, well, they get their pink color from shrimp. No, they don't. They get their pink color. They manufacture that color. And no matter what their diet is, they're pink. They hatch pink. They die pink. They're pink.
Is that
And
the same with flamingos?
no, it is not the same with flamingos. Flamingos do need to have the carotenoids in their diet or they will turn, well, the American flamingo, the one I study, they'll turn gray, and kind of a dull gray. And when you see these birds, you see, if you look at a flock, what you see is pink. But if you look at the individual birds, that gradation in pink in flamingos is amazing. I mean, it goes from, some of them are more orange, some of them are just brilliant pink, some of them are red, right? Scarlet. And then others are mostly white or gray.
They do need the shrimp to generate the pink
They do.
or to generate the color?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. So let me veer off and we'll come back to this, but I do want to ask you about this. My son and I have been talking about this recently, and my career was in marketing before I started doing this. So I think of things from that point of view. How do you position issues and ideas to motivate people to make a change or a purchase? And we read all the time, we hear all the time about the damage of climate change and the horrific things with glaciers and polar bears and all of that. And there's certainly some legitimacy to that. Setting aside the politics, you can't deny that there is climate change. But I wonder, if you look with bald eagles and peregrine falcons and wolves and redwoods and cherry trees, and maybe what you're talking about here in the Everglades, we've had some successes in bringing things back, in
Oh, yeah.
reintroducing animals. From your point of view, are we doing enough to publicize the wins? Because after a while, the negative is so relentless, it's hard not to just say, F it, there's nothing we can do. But all around the world, we're seeing that because of work that you're doing and others, we have some wins.
We do have some wins, like the flamingos, I feel, are coming back to Florida, and that's a major win. But I unfortunately, Scott, I do agree with the prevailing attitude is there are far more losses. And so we do need to take a credit for things like Everglades restoration. We are spending, as a public, both state and federal, we are spending billions of dollars on restoring something that is terribly important, but we also reap the benefits. All of the drinking water in South Florida, that includes the East and West Coast. So metropolitan areas of West Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, Miami, Naples, Fort Myers, on and on, are all dependent on the Everglades for their drinking water. And if we don't fix it, then we're not going to have any fresh water. And so it is really important, but the benefits to the environment itself, to the Everglades and to Everglades National Park, which is just a small part of the Everglades, is astounding. And the things that I have witnessed as we've restored this area are very profound. The first time I laid eyes on a bald eagle, I grew up during Silent Spring, and I had never seen a bald eagle till I came here. And like on the job 2 days, and I saw a bald eagle, and now they're obviously everywhere, right? I go back to visit where I grew up in Kentucky, and I was staying on the river a couple weeks ago, right across the river from Cincinnati, Ohio, and there are bald eagles flying by every day, right? And it's like those were not here when I was a kid. I can guarantee you that. So those are good wins, but at the same time, I am watching this hurricane that just hit Jamaica. That's insane. So we do have to keep in perspective that, yes, we can take a bow for some of the wins, but we really do have to be cognizant of, if we lose one battle, it's gone forever, right? You can't win the war. You have to win every battle. You lose one battle and you've lost that habitat that suffers as a result of that, say it's development, that's never coming back, right? If we lose places in the Everglades, they're not coming back. And so it is constant reminder. Yeah, we can win. Yeah, we can make progress. And the most important thing is human health and well-being is dependent on the natural resources that these places provide. As I just explained, our fresh water, what makes South Florida habitable, is the Everglades. And if it goes south, we're in trouble.
So you had mentioned that we're investing tens of billions of dollars into the restoration. Where is that going? What are we doing with that money?
Oh, it's mostly rerouting things that drained the Everglades, diked, and rerouted the water. It's almost all the cost share between the federal and state government. It's an equal split. And so the two agencies that are in charge at the federal level, it's the Army Corps of Engineers. And at the state level, it's the South Florida Water Management District. And both of those entities 50 years ago were working to destroy the Everglades. That was their mandate. Drain the swamp, make it habitable. We want to farm it. Maybe it's more than 50 years ago, 75 years ago. And since the year 2000, when Congress passed the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, that attitude has really changed. And so now the Corps and the district are working just as hard at Everglades restoration as they are at flood control and water supply, which was their only mandates up until the year 2000, pretty much. But it's not just those two agencies, although they hold the purse strings, and they are the ones who ultimately say, okay, we're going to fill this canal in, or we're going to reroute this canal and build this pump to rehydrate these wetlands. There are numerous agencies and non-governmental organizations that are involved in those decisions. Things like the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. So even though that they are kind of in charge, it is not just them making decisions on their own. I have been on numerous committees that actually decide where canals get filled in or new pumps get put in. And I'm still working on those things, even in retirement.
So not really retired.
I'm trying.
So is there conflict and controversy regarding each of these decisions, or is there generally? There are.
Yeah.
So there's not a universally accepted game plan.
No. And that is one of the things that you learn pretty quickly, is everybody has these opinions, and there are people who don't really care about Everglades restoration, who are here to exploit the landscape, who want to, they could care less if the national park was there, but they'd rather see condos out in Florida Bay. But those people are not really involved in Everglades restoration. But you do have conflicting ideas about how restoration should be done. And for example, many times the Native Americans, who, the Miccosukees, live in the Everglades, and they have a conflict with, hey, that's our ancestral land and you're trying to flood it. And so that creates conflict. That creates real conflict. And we have to work very hard to compromise. And my opinions about how important Florida Bay is, What about Lake Okeechobee? And sometimes those are in conflict, right? Lake Okeechobee needs to get rid of water. It's too full. Well, if you put that water out to the coasts, then it pollutes the coast and then I'm affected. And so there's all of these well-meaning, most of the people involved in Everglades restoration are extraordinarily well-meaning, and I congratulate them for that. And I know we've had conflicts, but I also deeply respect their commitment, whether I agree with them or not.
And so it's just an ongoing thing
Yes.
where the time and where the money and where the energy is going to be invested. And we don't always know what the result of that will be until some time has passed, right?
That is correct. And that's where adaptive management comes in. And that's something I'm still learning about is how do you adapt after you've done an action, right? So we filled in this canal. It's good or bad or indifferent. Well, we got to measure the environment. And that's where my data collection comes in, is then I report back. It's like, yeah, that did a remarkable job. That lowered salinity, increased productivity in Florida Bay. That's a good thing. Or I say, that didn't do anything. Maybe we should try something else. And this goes on everywhere in Everglades restoration. And that costs money.
Yeah, and time.
Time.
What does filling in a canal mean to a
Well,
layman?
literally filling in if you look at the Everglades, it is crisscrossed by man-made canals that were built since about 1880. Most of them since about 1950. The vast majority of these canals, and they were literally built to drain the Everglades, to get rid of it. Let's make it gone. And so those canals are still operated. And that means that, they go to the coast, they dump water that used to flow from Orlando all the way down to Florida Bay, and they just rapidly move it to the coast to get rid of it. Uh, and so because people are now living on what used to be Everglades, most of Dade County, most of the development in Dade County is not on the coast anymore. It's inland. That was Everglades. And so those people we can't just say, okay, the Everglades is back, go home. They're not going anywhere. And so we got to figure out how to keep what's left of the Everglades intact while balancing with, 10 million people.
Who
So,
all want fresh water.
who all want fresh water. So it is definitely a balancing act.
All right. Well, now let's move on. We had promised the audience flamingos, and we went off on a half-hour tangent, which is, by the way, what happens often in this show, because the guests that I have they're just so fascinating that you get them talking about something, and then you look up. Do you know Scott Weidensaul?
That name is so
Migration and
familiar.
owl expert. Okay. He's a migration and owl expert. My shows generally run about an hour. Scott and I got to talking and never bothered to look up. And when we did, we realized we've been going for 3 hours. And I'm not sure we ever got, I have these stacks of cards with questions. I'm not sure we got past the first 3, and off we went. But I do want to talk to you about flamingos. And there's multiple things to talk about, right? Let's talk about the article. It was Hurricane Idalia.
Yes.
Okay. So Hurricane Idalia hit, and that changed everything in the flamingo world, right?
Well,
or in the U.S. flamingo world.
Yeah, it did. It did. But we were already focused. My colleagues and I had done already before Hurricane Idalia hit in 2021 or 2023. We had already published 2 papers about flamingos in Florida. In my attitude, look, the person who founded we've had 3 directors of research at my office. The original one was Robert Porter Allen, who studied spoonbills and flamingos. The next person was Alexander Sprunt IV, who went by Sandy, and Sandy studied flamingos. And I come along, and each of those guys were around for 30 plus years. And then I come around and I start studying spoonbills, and then switch to flamingos. And the attitude always in Florida was, flamingos were here. They were hunted to extirpation. They were brought in as tourist attractions to various places. The one probably most famous is Hialeah Racetrack in Miami, where they had at one point 600 or 700 flamingos that were nesting. And so everybody took the scientific community, and this was Sandy Sprunt's work, said that all of those birds, was that Bob Allen's work too, all of those birds that you see flying around Florida, which were very rare in the wild, were escapees. And so the state of Florida actually had the Fish and Wildlife Commission actually considered them non-native species. And if you happen to have one end up in a rehab facility or was rescued, they would say you have to take it to Hialeah racetrack. You can't release it into the wild. Well, we see flamingos. The first time I saw flamingos in the wild was 1992. And I saw like 24, 26 of them on one of the islands out in the bay. And at that time, Sandy Sprunt was my boss. And when I told him about it, he said, those are all, escapees, or they left Hialeah racetrack. They'll probably go back. Well, my colleagues and I started working on a paper, and my initial response was, we would like to know where all these flamingos that we're seeing in Florida came from. And my immediate response was what I was taught. Those are escapees. Within a 3 or 4 hour meeting, when there are about 8 of us around a table at Zoo Miami, I became, in that 4 hour window, I went from saying they're all escapees to, oh, they are not.
What year was this?
That was 2015. By that time, we had already documented 2 birds in Florida Bay that were banded as chicks at Rio Lagartos in the Yucatan Peninsula. So we know at least those birds, and I knew that at the time too. At least those.
One of those was peaches?
No, we haven't gotten to peaches yet. That's where Idalia came in.
Okay.
This group had already published a paper about, yes, flamingos are native to Florida. My colleagues actually petitioned to the state of Florida to make them an endangered species. And so we were already, we have the Florida Flamingo Working Group, which is now about 30 or 40 people, and we got about 10 scientists, and my colleagues and I were all working on, hey, how do we get flamingos back to Florida? Well, along comes Hurricane Idalia, and here they are. So we estimate.
In the article that I read, you said maybe 300 to 400.
Yes, that was. I did that calculation based on eBird data.
Okay.
So we have another scientific publication coming out. It'll probably be out in the next couple of months, but it explains how I came up with those numbers. And so, yeah, there was probably a flock of, and this is not unusual. It's actually, they call them flamboyances with flamingos. They're upwards of, 5,000 birds. They can be huge flocks. And so this was probably a moderate sized flock of probably 500 or 600 birds that got pushed, trapped, followed. We don't know. We just know that a Hurricane Idalia, maybe they were in the eye, which has been documented before. And so if they were in the eye, there was probably a lot of mortality. There's probably a lot of mortality either way, because that was a big storm, very violent, and it probably killed a lot of them. But all of a sudden, you follow the track of the storm across the southeastern United States, and on both sides of where the storm path was, you have flamingos falling out. And they were documented in places where they had never been seen before. Lake Michigan, in Wisconsin, in, where I grew up, 50 miles from where I grew up, there were 2 flamingos at Cedar Creek, just outside of Cincinnati. They were Pennsylvania, Tennessee, basically the whole southeastern United States and some of northeastern United States had flamingos.
And where were they blown in from? Where did they come from?
Well, we speculate that if you look at the track of that storm, it kind of blew up. It was this small tropical depression one day, and it was located just south of Cuba, the western edge of Cuba, and it kind of did a comma shape. And within 3 or 4 days, it exploded into a Category 4 storm. And it just went between the Yucatan Peninsula and Cuba. And flamingos fly back and forth between those 2 habitats all the time. That's a major thoroughfare. There are huge nesting colonies in both the Yucatan and Cuba. And flamingos can fly thousands of miles. But, the 300 miles between those 2 places is nothing for them. And so what we suspect is there was this flock moving across. This storm went from nothing to an explosion, and just the birds got entrained. Like I said, pushed, captured, followed, whatever. And as that storm went straight north and hit the Big Bend area of Florida, everything started, and then it exited kind of in the North Carolina, South Carolina area. Flamingos everywhere.
I saw this morning on an eBird report that there were 2 spotted yesterday outside of Corpus Christi in Texas.
Yeah. And we expected that most of them would. They did exactly what my colleagues and I talked about when it happened, is that everybody said, well, they're going to die when winter comes. No, these flamingos they move. They're big, large, fast-moving birds, and so they've gradually moved south into mostly Florida. And you could see them that they were scattered in ones and twos and threes all throughout the eastern United States, and then you would see them like in all of a sudden there's a group of 20 in North Carolina, right? And so they're finding each other and they're moving south. And most of those birds ended up, we think, we're actually quite sure that they flew, most of them flew back to the Yucatan. But since that storm almost 2 years ago now, there have been about somewhere around 100 to 150 that have stayed here in Florida. We guess. We never see them all together. It's different days, different packets. But it's like, it's nothing now for somebody to, one of my former employees texted me yesterday. He said, yeah, we had Florida flamingos out in Florida Bay yesterday. And that is commonplace now. And the reason we know they came from the Yucatan is because I told you, prior to this, 2 birds that had been banded in the Yucatan were found in Florida Bay. After that storm, we had like 8 or 9 of them that were banded as chicks in the Yucatan that ended up in the United States. And so we were pretty certain they did that. Now let's get to Peaches, and this is where we're quite sure that this is what happened. Is Peaches was a male bird that was literally swimming off the coast of, I believe, St. Petersburg, and it would flamingos can swim. They can swim quite well, but they can't swim forever, right? They mostly, when you see them swimming, they walk out into the water and they swim around and then they come back. This is out in the middle of basically, 5 miles from shore. That bird was going to die. Some fishermen saw it.
Is that because they can't take off from the water? They need land in order to take flight?
If a flamingo is in the water, that bird had to have been exhausted. You got to remember, it had been in a hurricane, flying either in circles or around for days. So it's just exhausted. And it's not that they can't, I don't know if they can, I don't think they can take off from the water, but it's simply that that bird was exhausted. It was going to die. And it was, when it took it to the rehab center, and the rehabber there, Melissa, she just gave it food and water and it was fine, and rest. So Peaches is, he was there, and I got kind of an emergency permit to put bans on flamingos right after that event because they were so plentiful. And so we marked that bird with the ban that was US, and we also put a tracking device on it so that we could follow it. Unfortunately, the tracking device failed within a week. And at that point in time, it was still hanging out at Fort DeSoto State Park in Tampa Bay. And then some kite surfers got too close, scared it off. It was seen 2 days later just near Marco Island in Florida, and then it vanished. And there were a whole lot of people that were angry with me because they felt that the band and the tracking device that we put on were hurting the bird. And I put hundreds of bands on, literally thousands of bands on spoonbills, probably about 50 tracking devices. I know what goes on with these birds, but there was a media outcry because it was a flamingo. About 3 months ago, Frank, the person who I banded it with, he got a report from the Yucatan that band was seen, and we got pictures of it in a nesting colony. Frank Ridgely is the veterinarian at Zoo Miami. He was the person that he and I put the bands on it. And so that bird is currently raising young at Rio Lagartos Biosphere Reserve on the northern coast of the Yucatan. So we got pictures of it. The people that study flamingos there, and they put the bands on them there, set up this great big camera and watched it. And I think it raised young. I'm not sure about that. So we absolutely know that bird probably came from the Yucatan and definitely went back to the Yucatan.
Now, you mentioned that flamingos are great flyers and they can travel long distances. Are they, in addition to being travelers, are they seasonal migratory birds? I mean, are they wintering somewhere and summering somewhere else?
They do. Some species do. There are 6 species of flamingos, and they definitely migrate to where they nest, right? They spread out during the non-nesting season. They come together in these huge nesting colonies, literally sometimes tens of thousands of nesting pairs in one spot. And so that migration is well documented. But whether they do it seasonally is something that we really don't understand. All the data that we collected to show that flamingos were native to Florida showed that they show up here even before they were hunted to basically extirpation here in Florida. It was all seasons, year round. There wasn't a particular month that was higher than the others. We don't know if they nested in Florida. There's some evidence that they did. But, when you're a big pink bird and all your buddies want to fly someplace, you just go along with them. That's what you do. And so you see these big flocks move back and forth between the Bahamas and and Cuba, the Caribbean, the Yucatan, Venezuela. They have big nesting colonies. And that's what they do. And my colleague who started me on all this, Stephen Whitfield, who was also at Zoo Miami at the time, now he's at Audubon Park Zoo in New Orleans. He and some of our colleagues, I'm not part of this, are just published. It should be coming out. It's been accepted for publication, should be coming out anytime. Shows that these birds are so well mixed that there is not a genetic component. So the birds that are quote unquote captive at Hialeah are at Hialeah Racetrack have the same genetic makeup as those in the wild. And so they
There's
move.
not a Hialeah subspecies?
No. And they've been there since 1936. It's that the answer to that question is they may not have always been the same birds. Again, wild birds could come in and land and hang out with those birds that are there, and those birds could leave. And so it's just very interesting.
Now, the Hialeahs, do they have their wings clipped? Are they?
They originally did, and then they were actually banding them, and then they got so plentiful that they just stopped. And at the peak of their abundance, like I said, 600 or 700 birds, so 300 nests. They were producing hundreds of chicks every year. But as horse racing has declined in popularity, so has the caretaking of that flock. And I don't know anything about how they take care of them. They're still there, but they're down to probably 150 individual birds.
Are they considered wild?
No, they're considered captive. But like I said, how can you tell a difference?
So let's back up 100 years. Then we'll come forward and talk about Conchi and some of the other stuff. But for the members of the audience that don't know, roughly 100 years ago, especially in Florida, almost all wading birds were wiped out.
Yes.
Out of respect or love for women's fashion. So tell the audience about that.
Well, literally the fashion trend in the late 1800s roughly started, I guess, around 1860, but really reached peak popularity in the 1880s and 90s. Is women's hats had these elaborate feathers. The more elaborate, the more gaudy, the better the fashion. And women were actually, I have a hat with a full least turn on it, right? It's the whole bird, and it's the wings wrap around the sides. And, that made them feathers. You don't make them synthetically. You go kill the bird. And so throughout the Caribbean, and not just, especially in Florida, because, you could easily get the feathers to the millinery trade in New York City from here. These birds were just extirpated. You would go into these colonies where they would be thousands of these birds nesting together, multiple species, and they just walk in there with these really quiet little guns and just shoot them right off the nest. Chicks would starve to death, and they'd skin them right there, and then they would sell them. And they were, certain species were worth more. The feathers were worth more than gold by weight. So a pound of feathers was well worth more than a pound of gold, which really incentivized people here in Florida. You got to remember at the time that Florida was the wilderness. It was literally the Wild West, cracker cowboys and gunfights. And so there was no law enforcement. There was no law. And so the Everglades was this place where there were just these huge colonies, hundreds of thousands of birds nesting together in one spot. And the hunters would just come in and shoot them all.
And I read that in addition to killing the birds, and I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but the two wardens were murdered. The people who were charged with the responsibility of stopping the hunters.
That's correct. Guy Bradley here in the Florida Keys. He was. I frequently would go to the island where he lived out in a place called Flamingo, which is now in Everglades National Park. And if you're at the Flamingo outpost in Everglades National Park and you look out, looking south, this is the southern end of peninsular Florida, right? The only thing further south is the Florida Keys. If you look out, you see a set of islands there. One of them is called Frank Key. And there's conflicted. There's Frank Key, and right next to it is Oyster Keys. It's conflicting as to where Guy Bradley was shot, but he was hired. He was a law enforcement, state law enforcement, deputized law enforcement to keep people from hunting these birds because they had become so rare. And he heard gunshots and he saw a known poacher's boat, a poacher he had arrested several times before at Frank Key, or maybe Oysters. And so he rode out there to arrest them, and they shot him in his rowboat, pulled up sail, went to Key West. So they murdered him. There's plain and simple. Second warden was, I believe, in the St. Petersburg, maybe Tampa area, and his name was McLeod, and same situation. He went in to protect. He heard gunshots, went in to protect the colony, and they shot him. And so this is serious business when you're talking about the amount of money being transferred for shooting these birds and law enforcement coming in after these laws were enacted to try and stop that. Yeah, it's deadly serious.
Wow. And all of this that was happening is part of what led to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act?
That is correct. Yes, there were several things that happened. There's several even federal laws that were put into place prior to 1918. But that act really was the kind of the final nail in the coffin of, look, once people started dying, law enforcement started dying, and once people started pointing out, that you're literally walking around with dead animals on your head, public opinion really turned against the trade itself, right? The fashion died. But yeah, the Migratory Bird Treaty was really the one that said there will be no more of this, and that put an end to it. The reason that Guy Bradley was out there enforcing the laws is because there were laws. It's just that there was the people here in Florida at the time were going, somebody in New York can't tell me what I'm allowed to do and not allowed to do, right? And since the population of Florida was probably less than 1,000 Europeans, yeah, it was crazy.
It's some of these stories, it's hard to believe that they're true.
Yeah, indeed.
I've got family that grew up in they're still there, some of them, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and in a very poor area, makes Appalachia look rich. And it was not a long-term gig to be a game warden. When you have families that are literally starving and they go out, and what my uncle used to call, we'd go wild cow hunting, and they'd bring back the deer, and you couldn't get any locals to be the game wardens. You had to bring people from the outside, and they just didn't last long. They either got scared off or killed.
Well, this is interesting, is that Guy Bradley was a plume hunter, and the people that shot him, with their defense was, well, he was just protecting those colonies for his own benefit, which is patently untrue. But yeah, he, as a kid, traveled. Is a book called the Cruise of the Bonton, where a semi-famous ornithologist named Jean Chevalier was in Florida, and he was hunting birds. And the crew on his boat, the two people that he hired to sail him around Florida Bay, the Florida Keys, so he could shoot birds, were Guy Bradley and his brother. And they helped him, right? This ornithologist would pay them to go into places to shoot the birds. And he had a change of heart. I think in his own words, he basically said, I just couldn't take it anymore. I shot birds, and then I watched their chicks get eaten by rats and vultures and things. And they starved to death in the nest. And so he just had a coming to Jesus moment. And when he was offered the job to protect those colonies, he took it.
Well, that's I'm going to have to read that book. That sounds like a fascinating thing. Oh, tell us, as we get close to winding up, tell us about the future of flamingos in Florida. What do you see?
Well, I hope that they start nesting. It is just, and we were hoping, every nesting season, they nest kind of in throughout their range in April, May, June, that area. And so we keep hoping that they will start to nest, but we don't know that they're not nesting either. So we had another bird, the original bird that my colleagues, Frank and Steven, put a radio or a satellite tracking device on, was named Conky. And Conky was a bird that was captured in Key West, was rehabbed, released with a tracking device into Florida Bay. And Conky lived out there for 2 years and was only reported on the eBird portal 14 times. Nobody could see this bird. It hung out inside. This is, again, in a national park. The islands in Florida Bay are off limits to people. You're not allowed on them. And it would just hang out inside these islands and nobody would ever see it. And so do we know that they're not nesting in Florida right now? No, they you would think these flocks of 100 pink birds we could find. I got a report. This is just one example. Somebody called me and said, hey, I just saw a flock of 60 flamingos. This is a good friend of mine out in the bay. And he told me where he saw them. I went out in a boat the next day. One of my colleagues at the Water Management District went out in a helicopter. One of my colleagues at Everglades National Park went out in a float plane. We couldn't find him.
And the source that told you about him is a trusted source.
Yes. He is one of the people who keeps me informed. He runs name's Garl Harold, and he runs he takes tourists out on kayaking trips. And he takes them to this place called Snakebite, which is really a hot spot for flamingos and other wading birds. And he will call me from sitting out there in the middle of Everglades National Park on his cell phone, and he'll show me videos of what he's seeing. And so Garl and I talk on a regular basis, and that's a plug for Garl's coastal kayaking, by the way. You won't be disappointed if you go on a excursion with him. But he is always reporting to me these things. And he said, here they are. And he sent me pictures of these birds flying by. And couldn't find them.
The next day, multiple experts went out looking for 60 3-foot tall birds.
Yeah, 5-foot tall pink birds.
5-foot tall pink birds, and couldn't find them.
Couldn't find them. Again, Mark Cook, my colleague at the Water Management District, who does aerial surveys via helicopter in the Everglades as part of Everglades restoration, he'll see them on occasion, and he says that, they're in a helicopter and they're moving 160 miles an hour. He says, if I see them, they fly away from me, and they fly away very, very fast. It's hard for me to catch up to them in a helicopter. And so they don't want to be seen. So they don't want to be seen. They're not going to be seen.
Wow. Well, let's hope they do start nesting here, and let's hope we do get the restoration.
It would be a wonderful thing to have a native population of flamingos in the state of Florida again. Flamingos, Florida is greatly identified with flamingos, obviously. The flamingo is like on our lottery tickets. I mean, most people think of flamingos, they think of Florida. And it's a shame that for 100 years there were no flamingos in Florida to speak of. And it would be great to have them back and as part of, I could go out today and see flamingo.
Well, let's hope that happens. Have most of the ones along the eastern seaboard that blew in from the hurricane, have most of those either passed on or moved their way down into Florida?
They moved. Yeah, they probably, I don't think, we had a handful of them die. I'm sure there were many, many that died during the storm that nobody ever saw. And as a matter of fact, I've got, right after the storm, I was getting emails. I was constantly being sent emails, pictures. I did a lot of newscasts and things. And so I was one of the central clearinghouses for all this information. And at least 5 people wrote me and said, yeah, we found a dead one. So there are probably lots but the ones that survived the initial, they are almost all probably survived and ended up back in the Yucatan or Cuba. We can't say exactly where they came from. We know that some of them were raised as chicks in the Yucatan, and some of them stayed here in Florida, and they're still here.
Well, let's keep our fingers crossed. Hey, I'm going to throw my email up on the screen. If you've got questions for me, send them on in. If you spot a flamingo, alive or dead, send it to me, and I'll forward it to Jerry, and we'll get him to recognize that as part of the studies. Jerry, my last question is, what book would you recommend for our audience? What do you think they ought to be reading that's nature-based?
Well, what we just touched on, fascinating book by Stuart McKeever. It's spelled MCIVOR, called Death in the Everglades. And that is the story of Guy Bradley. And the plume trade. It's not just about Guy Bradley. It talks about the plume trade and the history of it. And I personally thought it was a great read. Of course, I work for the same company and have a great affinity for the man. It's fascinating history to hear about what Florida was like, 125 years ago.
Well, I will look forward to that. I have said before to the audience, this is a first world problem, but one of the burdens of being the host of this is I have a stack of books on my nightstand that is going to crack the legs soon, because every time I have these, either my guests have written fascinating books or they've recommended a fascinating book or both. And I do what I can to keep up, but at least I've given you one back to read Alfie and me.
Absolutely. And I will read that.
We can do that. Hey, by the way, however you're listening to this, Apple or Spotify or whatever you're doing, much appreciated. If you happen to be watching us on YouTube, do me a favor and hit subscribe. The more people we get that subscribe, the more people we're reaching with this message. What Jerry has shared over the last hour, I think is fascinating. I'd love for more people to hear that message, and it allows us to bring in more guests. So it's a neat combination. Drop a comment or hit like or do something. There's no cost. There's no time commitment. It's why we can remain ad free. I'll cover the cost of this because I'm just so thrilled and honored to do it and have people like Jerry. So I do ask that. Stay tuned at the end of this podcast. I do something, Jerry, you might not be familiar with. I do something called field notes. When I wrap up every podcast, I do about an 8 to 10 minute thing. I'll pick a single subject, a park or a bird or an animal or whatever it might be, and talk about that for a little bit. I really sincerely appreciate you giving us the time this morning and sharing this. This is a ton of stuff I did not know about flamingos, and I'm going to guess a lot of the audience didn't either. And so as we wrap up, and I try to close every show with this, if you're out there in nature, and I really hope you are spending some time outdoors, maybe not as beautiful as Jerry's backyard in Isla Mirada, but nonetheless, when you're out there, stay safe and stay curious. Jerry, thank you very much.
You are welcome, Scott. It's been my pleasure.
Hello and welcome to Field Notes. I'm your host, Scott Harris, and as we do following every podcast, we record a little thing called Field Notes, where I get to chat for a few minutes about something that I think might be of interest to you. I think it's because I think it might be of interest to me. So today is no exception for that. Today, we're going to talk about something called the Brutus whale. Now, it's pronounced Brutus, B-R-U-T-U-S or B-R-E-D-E-S, but it's spelled Bryde's, B-R-Y-D-E'' whale, which was a little confusing when I first heard this from Taylor Butts. Taylor's a podcast guest. He's a naturalist on the National Geographic Lindblad cruises. You might want to watch that podcast too. But he's the one that introduced me to this whale, which is kind of cool. The whale is named after a Norwegian whaling pioneer, Johan, and I'm guessing it's pronounced Brutus, but again, his last name is B-R-Y-D-E. I thought I knew cetaceans, in a little way I do, but I had never heard of this one. So this is brand new to me, might be brand new to you, and it's not dramatically different than a lot of other whales, but it is different. And it was new, so I thought it'd be kind of fun. This is a baleen whale as compared to a toothed whale. Toothed whales are sperm whales, beluga, narwhals, dolphins, porpoises, and of course the greatest hunters ever, killer whales or orcas, and they are so named because they have teeth. Baleen whales do not, and those include blue whales, right whales, gray whales, and humpback whales, and the Brutus whale. Brutus whales are warm weather whales. They like the tropical water, and so they avoid the poles. They stay a few degrees north and south of the equator. They like things warm, and so that is where they stay. That is where they live. There are really two different kinds of Brutus whales. There's a larger one that lives offshore and a smaller one that lives inside the coast and is sometimes called the Eden's whale, but they are both Brutus whales. And now there is something unique about the Brutus whale. They have a 3-stripe nose. Should be a picture of that up now. But if you look at the top of their head and you look down, they have 3 parallel stripes going down these ridges. That's called a rostrum, the top of their head. And they are the only one of the whales that has those 3 stripes. So that's kind of cool when you think about it. They're mid-sized for a whale. I mean, they're massive animals, but they're mid-sized for a whale. They're about 40 to 55 feet long when they're full grown and about 40 to 50 tons. They're fast-moving whales. They chase sardines and anchovies and mackerel. That's where they make their living. And they catch them by lunging through different schools of those fish. And they do bubble nets, similar to humpback whales, where they will go underwater and blow bubbles. And those bubbles effectively form a net or a fence around the fish. And then they go underneath and come up the middle and lunge up, grabbing as many fish as they possibly can and attracting other sea life, especially seabirds. When seabirds see bubble nets, they know there's food coming, so they're ready to go. They're not really migratory whales. They like to stay local to wherever they are. They like warm currents, and they follow the fish swarms. So if there's warm water, that's kind of where you'll find them, and they'll follow fish around. But they don't go too far north. They don't go too far south. They like it right where they live. They feed just below the surface, and oftentimes they'll fly along with their mouths open. And so they are known to some of the locals in the areas where they live as the surfing whale. because you just see this large open mouth skating across the top of the water. Now, their sounds are low frequency sounds, lots of moans and groans, and they're short and irregular. And that many people believe that's one of the reasons that they're one of the least studied of the great whales. They don't have this beautiful melodic sound that a humpback whale has or that the blue whales have. It's not a terribly appealing sound, and it just hasn't attracted a lot of researchers. It will. Number one, there's only so much research that can be done on the other whales. And number two, someone's going to make a name for themselves studying the Brutus whale. Again, because they haven't been studied much, there's not a definitive number as to how many there are, but best estimates are in the 80 to 100,000 range worldwide. They are found in the Galapagos. And I point that out because my wife and I, my friend Andy and I, are going in September. So I was very excited when preparing for this to find out that there are resident Brutus whales living in the Galapagos, especially around Isabella, Fernandino, and Santa Cruz islands we're visiting on that trip. So if I'm lucky, I'm going to see my first Brutus whales ever. In addition to that, as long as we're mentioning the Galapagos, you've got some short-finned pilot whales, some common dolphins, and some orcas that live down there. And the best season for the Brutus whales around the Galapagos is June and November, and we'll be there in September. So hopefully we'll get to see them. Anyway, maybe I introduced you to a new whale. It was kind of fun, showed you some pictures, a couple of facts. It might be worth doing some reading about. I appreciate you listening, as I always do. And if you're watching us on YouTube, do me a favor and subscribe. You've heard this before, but it helps us reach more people and helps us attract more guests. Drop a comment, hit like, all of it's appreciated. And if you're getting outside, and I hope you are, stay safe and stay curious. Have a great day. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed learning about Bryde's whales or Brutus whales.